The morning of Dorothy Wren's funeral, Eli Carter was 12 years old. Wearing his only good shirt, a pale blue button-down his mother had ironed 3 times the night before because the collar kept curling, and he was standing at the back of a church he had never been inside, surrounded by people he had never seen, wondering why a lawyer he had never met was looking for him. He had walked to St. Bridget's alone. His mother had wanted to come, but she had a double shift at the hospital that she couldn't give up. Not with rent due in 11 days and the heating bill sitting on the kitchen counter where she'd put it, so she would stop pretending it wasn't there. She had pressed both her hands against his cheeks before he left, looked at him the way she did when she wanted to say something important and couldn't find the right shape for it, and then just said, "You were a good boy to her, Eli. You were a very good boy." He hadn't known what to do with that, so he had nodded, taken the bus, and sat in the last pew of St. Bridget's watching strangers cry over a woman he had eaten soup with twice a week for 2 years. He didn't know she was wealthy until that morning. He hadn't known much about her at all, really, except how she liked her soup not too hot, 2 crackers on the side, never the oyster kind, and that she watched the 6 o'clock news every evening with the volume turned up high enough to hear it from the hallway, and that she had, in the particular way of people who have been very lonely for a very long time, occasionally said things to him that he suspected she hadn't said to anyone else in years. The lawyer's name was Bernard Aldrich. He was 60-something, round-faced, with the deliberate calm of a man who had delivered news of this kind before and understood the importance of doing it slowly. He found Eli after the service, while the other mourners were moving toward the reception hall in small, quiet clusters, and he said, "Are you Eli Carter? 11 Carter Street, apartment 2C? And Eli said yes, and Bernard Aldrich said, "I need you to come with me. There are some things in Mrs. Wren's will I need to go over with you and your mother." That was how it started. Or rather, that was how it ended. Where it actually started was 26 months earlier, on a Thursday evening in late November, when it was so cold in the hallway of their building that Eli could see his own breath, and from behind the door of apartment 4 became a sound he would not have been able to name precisely, but that landed in his chest with a feeling he recognized immediately. Someone crying alone. Eli had grown up in the building on Carter Street, the way kids grow up in places that aren't meant to be permanent but become permanent anyway through the slow accumulation of ordinary days that add up to something without anyone deciding they would. His mother Sandra had moved them into apartment 2C when Eli was 4, after the arrangement with Eli's father had concluded in the specific way those arrangements sometimes conclude, quietly and without explanation, with a man's name on a lease becoming just a name. She had taken the apartment because it was 2 bus stops from Mercy General, where she worked as a patient care aide, and because the building accepted the housing voucher she qualified for, and because it had 2 bedrooms, which meant Eli could have his own room, which she had decided was non-negotiable even when everything else was negotiable. She had painted Eli's room a pale yellow the first weekend they moved in. She'd bought the paint with money she probably shouldn't have spent and done it herself on a Saturday morning with Eli sitting in the doorway on a folded towel, handing her the brush when she needed it. That was the kind of woman Sandra Carter was, the kind who would spend money she didn't have on paint for her son's bedroom because the color of the walls mattered, because how a child felt in a room mattered, because some things were worth spending money on even when you were stretching every dollar until it looked like something else. Eli understood from early on that their life required a specific kind of management. Not that Sandra ever laid it out for him directly, not in the way adults sometimes do when they want children to understand that things are hard. She was careful to shield him from the worst of it, from the calls she took in the bathroom with the door closed, from the months when she worked 16-hour days and came home so tired she fell asleep on the couch still in her scrubs, from the calculations he nonetheless overheard sometimes at the kitchen table late at night, the soft and private math of a woman making numbers do things they didn't want to do. But Eli was observant in the way that children who grow up close to the edge of things learn to be observant, and he understood without being told that the crackers in the cabinet were measured, that the heat stayed low until it truly couldn't, that new shoes happened at the beginning of a school year and nowhere else. He had learned, by the time he was 10, to notice when Sandra was tired in a way that was different from regular tired. He had learned to make his own lunch on those mornings without being asked, to keep his volume down, to make himself easy. He was not a child who resented this. He was a child who loved his mother with the specific, clear-eyed love of someone who has watched another person try very hard and understood what that trying cost. The building on Carter Street was 4 stories, 22 units, and the kind of place that had once been better than it currently was and knew it. The carpeting in the hallways was dark green and worn thin in the middle where feet had traveled it longest. The elevator worked 3 weeks out of 4. The boiler made a sound every November that management promised to address and never fully did. The super, a man named Gerald Marsh, had the resigned competence of someone who had stopped expecting the owners to do things properly and had adjusted his definition of properly downward to match what was actually available. The building had the particular social texture of places where people live in close proximity to each other out of necessity rather than choice, a surface-level familiarity that stopped just short of real knowledge. People knew each other's faces, knew the general outline of each other's situations the way you learn those things through thin walls and shared laundry rooms, but they kept to themselves in the deliberate way of people who have learned that closeness in difficult circumstances can complicate already complicated lives. The woman in apartment 4B was Dorothy Wren, and almost no one on Carter Street knew anything about her except that she was old, that she had lived in the building longer than anyone else currently living there, and that she was, as Gerald Marsh put it to anyone who asked, difficult. She was 79 years old, and she had lived in 4B for 11 years. She moved in 3 months after her husband passed, which was something almost no one in the building knew because almost no one in the building had asked. She had white hair cut short and practical, blue eyes that were still sharp in a face that had settled into its final arrangement of lines, and a manner that most people experienced as cold and a smaller number of people would have identified, if they'd had occasion to look more carefully, as the specific guardedness of someone who has been disappointed enough times to stop making herself available for another round of it. She returned greetings when they were offered and did not offer them herself. She received packages and brought them inside immediately. She did not attend the building's occasional informal gatherings. She paid her rent on the 1st of every month, in a money order she left in an envelope outside Gerald Marsh's door. Gerald had tried twice in the first year of Dorothy's residence to engage her in conversation and had been met with responses so economical that he eventually concluded she simply wasn't interested and stopped trying. He described her to Sandra Carter once, when Sandra mentioned noticing the light always on in 4B late at night, as one of those old people who just wants to be left alone, and you got to respect that even if it seems sad. Sandra had nodded and said she supposed that was right. What Sandra didn't know, what almost no one on Carter Street knew, was that on some mornings Dorothy Wren stood at her kitchen window for a long time looking at the parking lot below, at the comings and goings of the people she didn't speak to, and that her face in those moments held an expression that had nothing economical about it at all. That on some evenings she called a number in her phone that rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and she didn't leave a message, just hung up and set the phone on the kitchen table and sat with it for a while. That she had a doctor she saw every 6 weeks who had told her 14 months ago that her heart was failing in a slow, ordinary way that medicine could manage but not reverse, and that she had received this information and returned home on the bus and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and been very quiet for the rest of the day. None of this was visible from the hallway. What was visible from the hallway, on a Thursday evening in late November, to a 12-year-old boy coming home from school with his backpack over one shoulder and a plastic container of leftover soup his mother had left for him in a note on the counter, was a thin line of light under the door of 4B. And a sound. Eli stopped. He had been in a hurry. He had homework and he was cold, and the soup his mother had left was chicken and rice, his favorite, and the apartment was going to be empty until 9 when Sandra got off her shift, which meant the couch and the television and approximately 4 hours of doing exactly what he wanted. He had been thinking about all of this when the elevator let him out on the 4th floor, where he sometimes stopped to drop something at the communal recycling bin at the end of the hall, and he had been halfway to the bin when the sound from 4B reached him through the door. He stood still in the hallway for a moment. The crying was not loud. It was the kind of crying that tries not to be crying, the kind you could convince yourself wasn't there if you wanted to convince yourself. Eli had heard his mother cry like that once, when she thought he was asleep. He had not been asleep. He had lain very still and listened to the particular quality of it, the way it tried to stay contained and kept slipping out anyway, and it had done something to him that he didn't have words for yet. He stood in the hallway outside 4B for a full minute, not deciding anything, just listening. Then he looked down at the container of soup in his hand. He thought about it. The soup was his. He had been thinking about it since he got off the bus. His mother had made it yesterday, and the rice would have softened just right by now, the way he liked it, and there was exactly enough for a proper meal and not a lot else. He knocked on the door of apartment 4B. The crying stopped immediately. Not gradually immediately, in the way of someone who has reflexes specifically built for this kind of surprise. There was silence behind the door for long enough that Eli began to wonder if he had done the wrong thing. Then the voice came, clipped and cautious. "Who is it?" "It's Eli. From 2C. He paused. "I live downstairs." Another silence. Shorter this time. "What do you want?" Eli looked down at the container in his hands. "I have soup," he said. "My mom made chicken and rice. There's extra." This was not exactly true, but he said it without hesitating because somehow the not exactly truth felt like the right shape for what he was trying to do. "I thought maybe you might want some." The silence that followed was long enough that Eli understood she was deciding something. That behind the door, in an apartment he'd never been inside, an old woman was weighing something she probably hadn't expected to have to weigh tonight. The chain slid back. The deadbolt turned. The door opened for inches. Dorothy Wren looked at him through the gap. Her eyes were red at the rims, which she clearly knew and clearly was choosing not to address, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been caught at something private and is deciding in real time whether to be angry about it or not. She looked at Eli. She looked at the container of soup. "I don't like oyster crackers," she said. Eli shook his head. "It's the regular kind. My mom only gets regular." Dorothy looked at him for another moment. Then she opened the door. The inside of apartment 4B was smaller than it looked from the hallway and more organized than Eli had expected, in the way that spaces become organized when their occupant has had a long time to figure out exactly where things should go. The furniture was old but well-kept: a sofa with a slipcover in a dark floral pattern, a reading chair by the window with a floor lamp beside it, a small television on a wooden stand against the far wall tuned to the news with the volume at a level that explained why it was audible from the hallway. On the kitchen table were a cup of tea gone cold and a book lying face down at the page it had been reading when something interrupted it. Eli stood inside the door while Dorothy went to the kitchen and got a bowl from the cabinet with the efficient, self-contained movements of someone used to doing everything alone. She poured the soup without being asked, returned the container to him with a look that said she was not keeping it, and set the bowl on the kitchen table across from the cold tea. She sat down. She looked at the soup. "You're Sandra Carter's boy," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I've seen you on the elevator." She picked up her spoon. "You hold the door for people. My mom says you're supposed to." Dorothy looked at him. Something in her expression shifted very slightly, not warmly exactly, but with a quality of attention that was different from the brief assessing look she'd given him at the door. She looked at the bowl and then at him. "Are you going to stand there?" Eli pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. They sat together at her kitchen table while she ate and the television made its low, continuous commentary about the world. Eli did not talk much. He had learned, from spending hours in his mother's silences at the end of long days, that silence wasn't always an absence of something. Sometimes it was the thing itself, the actual content of a moment. He looked at the book on the table. It was a history of the American railroad system. It was 400 pages long and the bookmark was near the end. "Is it good?" he asked, nodding at it. Dorothy glanced at it. "It's accurate," she said, which Eli took as yes. She finished the soup. She set the spoon down precisely, parallel to the bowl's edge, and looked out the window at the dark parking lot below. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way certain people say things they're not in the habit of saying plainly, without decoration, as if the word was too specific and true to need any help from the words around it. "You're welcome," Eli said. He stood, picked up his empty container. "I should go. I have homework." Dorothy nodded. She looked at her cup of cold tea. "What grade are you in?" "7th. Math hard this year?" "Pre-algebra." He considered. "Kind of." She nodded again, as though this confirmed something she'd already thought. "Don't let them tell you algebra is hard," she said. "It isn't. It's just unfamiliar. There's a difference." Eli looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. He went to the door. He had his hand on the knob when she said, without turning around, "Your mother makes a good soup." Eli paused. "I'll tell her you said so." He went out into the hallway and heard the deadbolt slide home behind him. He stood in the dim corridor for a moment, looking at the worn green carpet, the single fluorescent tube overhead that had been flickering for 6 months. He thought about the sound he'd heard through the door. He thought about the cold cup of tea. He thought about what it looked like when someone had been sitting alone in a kitchen for a long time. He went downstairs to his own apartment and did his pre-algebra homework and ate the last of the crackers from the cabinet and watched television until his mother came home. That night, before he fell asleep, he thought about what his mother had said to him once when they'd passed a man sleeping on a bench on the way to the grocery store, and he'd asked her why nobody stopped. She had been quiet for a moment, thinking about it the way she thought about things she wanted to get exactly right. Then she said, "People get used to looking away, baby. It gets easier every time they do it. That's the scary part, it gets easier." She had taken his hand. The trick is to not do it the first time. He fell asleep thinking about that. The next Thursday, he knocked on the door of 4B again. He had a container of vegetable beef this time, his mother's other recipe, and he stood in the hallway with it and knocked twice, evenly. The chain slid back in about half the time it had taken the first week. Dorothy looked at him through the 4-inch gap. She looked at the container. "Not oyster crackers?" she said. "Regular," Eli confirmed. She opened the door. If you had asked Eli Carter at that point what he thought he was doing, he would have found the question difficult to answer. He wasn't doing it for any particular reason he could have named. He wasn't doing it because someone told him to, or because he expected something in return, or because he had decided in some deliberate and organized way that this was the right thing. He was doing it the way you do things that feel, without announcement or argument, simply correct the way you hold an elevator door or pick up something someone drops without it occurring to you that you could just as easily not. He was 12 years old. He had not yet developed the adult habit of requiring his good intentions to make sense before acting on them. He just showed up. He showed up the Thursday after that, and the Thursday after that, and by the 4th visit the chain wasn't on when he knocked, which he understood was a form of communication. By the 6th visit, Dorothy had started having the bowls already out on the counter when he arrived, which he understood was another kind. They had a routine by December. Eli knocked. Dorothy opened the door. He handed over the container. She poured the soup. They sat. Sometimes they talked. More often they existed in the same room in a quiet that had stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling, simply, like what it was: two people, a 12-year-old and a 79-year-old, sitting together in a kitchen while the news ran in the background, connected by nothing more than proximity and a decision, made once and then made again, to not look away. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Sandra found out about the soup visits in the 3rd week, when she went to reach for the container and it wasn't where she expected it. She asked Eli, and Eli told her. And Sandra stood at the kitchen counter with the expression she wore when she was processing something that had more parts to it than she'd anticipated. "The woman upstairs," she said. "4B? Dorothy Wren?" "She cried the first time," Eli said matter-of-factly. "I heard her through the door." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "She cried. I don't think she meant to, or I don't think she knew I heard." He was looking at his backpack zipper. "She was alone." Sandra looked at her son for a long moment. She had raised him in this apartment, in this building, in this specific city, on the specific income of a patient care aide who worked double shifts and stretched groceries and got the paint for his bedroom walls from a liquidation sale. She had raised him on what she had available, which was not always much, but which had always, reliably, included the understanding that other people's suffering was not decoration and not background noise and not someone else's problem. Looking at him now, she thought, "It stuck." "I'll make extra on Thursdays," she said. Eli looked up. "And Sundays," Sandra said, turning back to the cabinet. "Cold weather. She probably needs it more than once a week." What Sandra did not say, and what Eli didn't know yet, was that she had noticed the light in 4B. She had noticed it from the parking lot on nights she came home late, that single yellow square on the 4th floor that was almost always still on at 9 and 10 and sometimes 11 at night, and she had thought about it in the peripheral way you think about things that are not your responsibility but sit at the edge of your awareness anyway, present and unaddressed. She had not done anything about it because she hadn't known what to do, and because she was tired in the specific way that leaves very little room for additional items, and because Gerald Marsh had said the woman just wanted to be left alone. But her son had knocked on the door, and the chain had come off. The soup became a twice-weekly thing. Thursdays and Sundays, Eli went up with his backpack still on sometimes, or with his jacket half unzipped, or with homework under his arm, not making a production of it, not arranging himself into something it was convenient to show up as, just showing up the way he actually was. Dorothy received him the same way each time. Door open, bowls out, the television on, and the particular stillness of a woman who has stopped pretending the company isn't welcome. She asked him about school. Not the generic questions adults sometimes asked, not how's school, in the way that didn't want a real answer, but specific questions, the kind that required him to have actually been paying attention. She asked what they were reading in English class and whether he thought the ending was earned. She asked what his math teacher's name was and then said, without elaboration, that she hoped the woman explained her reasoning on the board, not just her conclusions. She asked one Sunday in January what he wanted to be when he grew up. Eli thought about it seriously, the way he'd learned she expected things to be thought about. I don't know yet, he said. My mom says that's okay at 12. Your mother is right, Dorothy said. Anyone who tells a 12-year-old they should know what they want to be hasn't thought carefully enough about what growing up actually requires. She looked at her soup. What are you interested in? Not what do you want to be. What are you interested in? Eli thought about it. Maps, he said after a moment. Like how they work. How they decide what to put on them and what to leave out. Dorothy looked at him. Cartography, she said. Is that a job? It can be. She considered. Do you know what a projection is? In map making? He shook his head. She explained it. She explained it in the specific, unhurried way of someone who knew the subject well enough to know where to start and how to move through it, talking about how every flat map of a round Earth requires a compromise, how you cannot preserve all distances and all shapes and all directions at once, how every map is a decision about which truth to prioritize and which to distort in service of the one you've chosen. She talked for 11 minutes. Eli listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, she picked up her spoon and went back to her soup, and the television filled in the silence. Eli sat for a moment. That's kind of like everything, he said. Dorothy looked at him. What do you mean? Like, every choice about what to show means something gets left out. He was looking at the table. That's kind of how everything works. Not just maps. Dorothy was quiet. She looked at him with an expression that was different from the ones he'd catalogued so far, not the guardedness, not the careful economy, not the brief warmth she allowed herself sometimes around the edges of a conversation. This was something more direct. The look of someone who has been surprised, not unpleasantly, and is taking a moment to register it. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. She didn't say anything else about it. She went back to her soup and the television ran its news and the building settled around them in its usual winter sounds. But something had shifted slightly and permanently in the specific quality of the silence between them. The way it does when two people discover they are, against all the reasonable odds of the situation, actually talking. Eli went home that evening and looked up cartography on his phone for 45 minutes. He found a map drawn in 1569 by a Flemish geographer named Mercator that had been used by sailors for 400 years. He found the place where Africa should have been larger and Greenland should have been smaller and understood. Looking at it, exactly what Dorothy had meant about the compromises a flat world required. He put his phone down and looked at the ceiling of his pale yellow bedroom. He thought about what it meant that an old woman alone in an apartment on the 4th floor had just taught him something that his school hadn't gotten to yet. He thought about the cold cup of tea and the book lying face down and the sound he'd heard through the door that first night. He thought about his mother saying the trick is to not do it the first time. Outside, the December wind moved through the gap under the window the way it always did in winter, and the building made its usual sounds, and somewhere above him, in apartment 4B, the light was still on. By February, Eli had learned the following things about Dorothy Wren. She took her tea with no sugar and a small amount of milk, added in a specific order milk first, then tea, and she would drink it cold if she forgot about it, which she sometimes did when she was reading. She had strong opinions about the news, which she watched every evening at 6 and sometimes again at 11, and she expressed these opinions quietly to herself or to Eli, in short declarative sentences that cut straight to whatever the actual point was. She had been to 14 countries. She did not volunteer this information. It came out in the context of other things, a comment about a news story involving Portugal, a mention of what the light looked like in the Azores in the early morning that was so specific and unhurried it was clearly drawn from memory. She had a photograph on the windowsill in the bedroom. Eli had seen it once, briefly, when the bedroom door was open and he was waiting in the hallway while Dorothy got the bowls of a man and a woman standing somewhere with mountains behind them. The man was tall and dark-suited and the woman was younger and looked like she might be laughing. The photo was old. It was the only photograph he'd seen in the apartment. He had also learned that she was not, as Gerald Marsh had described her, simply difficult. She was, more precisely, a person who had decided some time ago that there was a cost to being open to people and had decided the cost was too high, and had arranged her life accordingly. This was different from difficult the way a locked door was different from a wall. One of them had a reason, and the other was just solid material. Eli was 12 and didn't have words for this distinction yet, but he felt it. He felt it in the way her guard came down so incrementally that each step was almost invisible, in the way she sometimes started talking about something in the middle of it, as though she'd been having the first part of the conversation in her own head before he arrived and had simply continued out loud when he knocked. He felt it most clearly one Sunday in February when he arrived to find Dorothy not in the kitchen but sitting in the reading chair by the window, and the bowls not on the counter, and her face holding an expression that was different from anything he'd catalogued yet. Not sad exactly. Tired. Not the regular tired of a long day, but something older and more settled, the kind of tired that lives in the body rather than the schedule. "Do you want me to heat it up?" Eli asked. He meant the soup. He was already moving toward the kitchen. "Leave it," Dorothy said. "Just sit for a minute." He sat. He put his backpack on the floor and sat in the chair across from her by the window, and they looked out at the parking lot together. It was gray outside, the flat February gray that made the city look like a photograph of itself, and the bare trees along the sidewalk were dark against the pale sky. After a while, Dorothy said, "Do you know what I miss most?" Eli didn't say anything. He'd learned that she didn't usually ask questions she wanted answered immediately. "Mornings," she said. "I used to go walking in the mornings. Early. Before 7. I liked the city when it was still deciding whether to wake up." She was looking at the window. "I can't do that anymore. My ankles don't cooperate." Eli looked at her ankles, which were resting on a small footstool. They were swollen, he noticed now. Not dramatically, but enough. "My mom has a bad knee," he offered. "From standing all day. She says it's just the price of the work." Dorothy looked at him. "What kind of work?" "Patient care aide. At Mercy General." Dorothy nodded. "Hard work. She says it's important work. She says the people she takes care of are scared, and scared people need someone calm to talk to, and she's calm." He was looking at his hands. "She's really calm. I don't know how she does it." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Some people are built that way," she said. "Your mother sounds like one of them." Eli nodded. He looked back out the window. A car was pulling slowly out of a parking space below, its headlights pale in the gray afternoon. "She knows I come up here," he said. "She thinks it's a good idea." Dorothy looked at him. "Does she?" "She started making extra on purpose. On Thursdays and Sundays. She said if I was going to do something I should do it right." Dorothy looked out the window again. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, the slight shift, the quality of attention moving inward briefly before returning to the surface. "She sounds like a sensible woman," she said. The words came out a little careful, as though she were placing something fragile down. They sat together a while longer. The soup heated up eventually, and Dorothy ate it in the chair instead of at the table, which she'd never done before, and Eli sat across from her with his homework on his knee and did his reading while the news ran on the television and the February light went from gray to the darker gray that meant evening was coming. "Before he left," Dorothy said, without particular emphasis, "Come Tuesday too if you want. There's no reason it has to be only twice a week." Eli looked at her. She was looking at the television. "Okay," he said. He went downstairs and told his mother, and Sandra looked at him for a moment with the expression she wore when she was choosing not to say all of what she was thinking, and then she said, "I'll figure out the Tuesdays," and went back to what she was doing. The The building on Carter Street had its own opinion about Dorothy Wren, and the opinion was not generous. There were 7 other residents on the 4th floor, and most of them had at some point had an experience of Dorothy that had confirmed Gerald Marsh's original assessment. Difficult. There was the woman in 4A, a nurse named Patricia, who had once attempted to introduce herself in the elevator and received a response so clipped it felt like a rebuke. There was the couple in 4D, Tim and Margot, who had complained to Gerald that Dorothy's television was too loud on evenings when their baby was trying to sleep, and when Gerald had knocked and relayed the request, Dorothy had simply looked at him and then closed the door, and the volume had not changed for 3 days before coming down slightly, which Gerald had described to Tim and Margot as a partial victory and privately thought was probably the best anyone was going to get. There was the building itself, which had been bought 18 months ago by a property management company called Vantage Residential, whose approach to their portfolio was best described as optimization, and whose idea of optimization was best described as replacing current residents with ones who could pay higher rents without the assistance of housing vouchers. Gerald Marsh had received 2 memos from Vantage in the past year, both phrased in the language of operational efficiency, and both arriving at the same practical conclusion. Certain long-term residents were going to need to be moved along. Dorothy Wren had been on Carter Street for 11 years. Her rent, under the original lease she'd signed with the previous owner, was significantly below what Vantage wanted the 4th floor units to bring. They had declined to renew her lease on its original terms. They had offered a new lease at a number Dorothy had received in the mail in a white envelope, stared at for a long moment, and then set on the kitchen table where it had been sitting for 3 weeks. Eli didn't know about the envelope. He didn't know about Vantage Residential. He didn't know about the memo Gerald had received, or the conversation Gerald had had with Dorothy in January in which he tried, in his resigned and decent way, to soften something that didn't have a soft version. What Eli knew was that sometimes, when he arrived on Tuesdays or Thursdays or Sundays, Dorothy had a particular stillness about her that was different from her usual stillness, a stillness that had something underneath it, something pressed down. And he had learned not to ask directly about it because she would not tell him directly, but to sit with it and wait, because sometimes she would tell him in the sideways way she told things, through a comment about something else that turned out to be about the actual thing. One Tuesday in March she said, without preamble, "Have you ever been asked to leave a place you had every right to be in?" Eli looked at her. Like, kicked out. Like told that your presence was no longer convenient for the people who benefited from it. He thought about it. "There was a park near our old apartment," he said. "When I was little, they put a fence around it and said it was being renovated, but they never renovated it. My mom said they just didn't want kids in it anymore." Dorothy looked at him. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. "The mechanism is always the same. Make it difficult enough that it appears to be a choice." She didn't say anything else about it. But Eli went home that evening and told his mother what Dorothy had said, and Sandra was quiet for a moment and then said, "She might be having trouble with the lease. Vantage has been doing that across the whole building." She looked at her own kitchen table, where an envelope from Vantage sat, not yet opened. "They're doing it to us too." Eli looked at the envelope. "We're going to be okay," Sandra said, in the voice she used when she wanted that to be true and was still working on it. "Don't worry about that." He didn't say anything. He looked at the table and thought about Dorothy sitting in her reading chair with the footstool, watching the parking lot. At school, Eli's classmates had a range of responses to the information that he spent time every week with an elderly neighbor. Most of them didn't care because at 12 years old, the internal lives of other people are largely managed as background phenomena. A few of them thought it was nice in the abstract way that people think things are nice when they're not personally involved in them. And one of them, a boy named Kevin Park who sat 2 rows behind Eli in English and had the specific social confidence of someone who had discovered early that being the first to say a thing out loud gave you a kind of authority over the conversation, thought it was an opportunity. "You actually go sit with her?" Kevin said one afternoon in the lunch line. He wasn't being cruel exactly. He was being the specific kind of dismissive that 12-year-old boys use when something confuses them and they'd rather make it ridiculous than admit they're confused. Like, "Every week? What do you even talk about?" "Different things," Eli said. "Like what? What could you possibly have to talk to some old lady about?" "Maps," Eli said. "Railroad history. What the light looks like in the Azores." Kevin looked at him blankly. She's been to 14 countries, Eli said. Kevin made a sound that was supposed to convey that this was not impressive. So? My cousin's been to 6 countries and he's boring. Eli shrugged and picked up his tray. The truth was that he didn't have a version of this that would translate into the language Kevin was speaking, because the language Kevin was speaking was one in which value was self-evident and required no explanation, and what Eli valued about those Tuesday and Thursday and Sunday evenings was not the kind of thing that came across in a lunchline summary. It was accumulated. It lived in small moments. It was the kind of thing you had to be inside to understand. He stopped trying to explain it and Kevin found another subject. And life continued. By spring, the routine had become something different from a routine. Routines were things you did without thinking. What Eli did on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays required a particular kind of attention that didn't diminish with repetition because Dorothy was not a person you could engage with on autopilot, and because the quality of her health by April had begun to require a different kind of noticing. The ankles were worse. She mentioned it only once and then didn't mention it again, but Eli could see the slightly longer time it took her to get up from the reading chair, the way she held the counter edge when she moved through the kitchen. She had a doctor's appointment in April and came back from it with the settled, unsurprised look of someone who has been told something they already knew and has already made their peace with it. Did the doctor say anything? Eli asked that Sunday. Doctors say many things, Dorothy said. Most of it is just a formal version of something the body has already told you. Is it your heart? She looked at him. Her expression did not alarm. It did what it always did when she was assessing whether he could handle the honest version. Then she said, Yes, it's my heart. It's been my heart for a while. The doctors are managing it. Okay, Eli said. You're not going to ask me if I'm scared? He thought about it. Are you? She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window. No, she said. I've had time to get used to the shape of it. What I mind more is the inconvenience. Eli nodded slowly. My mom says the same thing about her knee. Dorothy looked at him and made the sound she sometimes made that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, a brief exhale with something warm in it. Your mother and I would probably get along, she said. I keep telling her to come up, Eli said. She says she will when she has more time. Tell her not to wait for more time, Dorothy said. Time doesn't come in more. It just comes in different. Eli looked at her. He wrote it down when he got home on the back of a homework paper because it seemed like the kind of thing that would be important to have gotten right. He had a small collection of these by now, things Dorothy had said that felt like they were about more than what they appeared to be about. Things he suspected would mean more to him in 5 or 10 years than they did right now. Algebra is just unfamiliar, not hard. Every map is a decision about which truth to prioritize. Time doesn't come in more. It just comes in different. He kept them on a piece of paper folded into the cover of his geography notebook. He didn't tell anyone about it. It was just his. The first time Eli saw the letter opener, he didn't think anything of it. He had gone to get the bowls from the cabinet while Dorothy was in the bathroom, and on the counter next to the dish rack was a letter opener he hadn't noticed before, silver, slim, with a small engraved detail along the handle that was too fine to read from a distance. He had registered it vaguely as an object, the way you register the ordinary contents of other people's kitchens, and then thought nothing more about it. The second time, it was on the kitchen table next to a stack of correspondence, and he was closer. He could see the engraved detail more clearly now, a small monogram worked into the silver. Not the kind of monogram you put on something ordinary. The kind of monogram a very specific craftsperson put on something that was meant to last. He didn't say anything. He put the bowls on the table and set out the crackers and went to the chair. The third time was a Tuesday in May when he arrived to find Dorothy on the phone in the kitchen, her back to him, speaking in a voice so different from the one she used with Eli that for a moment he thought he'd knocked on the wrong door. Low and precise, with a fluency of technical language that he couldn't follow but recognized as the language of people who had spent a long time in rooms where important things were decided. She was saying something about a trust instrument and then something about a distribution schedule, and her voice had a specific authority in it that Eli had not heard from her in any of the 80-odd visits to this kitchen. She saw him in the doorway and held up one finger. He sat down and waited. She finished the call with 2 short sentences and set the phone down and turned around, and the voice and the manner went back to what he knew, smoothly and completely, the way a person shifts registers when they move between rooms. "Sorry," she said. "Business." "What kind of business?" Eli asked, genuinely curious. "The boring administrative kind," Dorothy said, going to the counter. "Old obligations that still require tending." She did not elaborate. Eli did not press. But he filed it the way he filed things quietly, in some back part of his mind that kept a running account of the things that didn't fully add up. The letter opener. The phone call. The 14 countries. The railroad book read all the way to the end. The single photograph with the mountains. The way she talked about light and about maps and about the precise moral geography of difficult decisions with the ease of someone who had not merely read about these things but had navigated them. He had begun, by late spring, to understand that there was more to Dorothy Wren than a woman alone in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building that wanted her gone. He didn't have a shape for what the more was yet. He just knew it was there. The Vantage situation came to a head in June. Dorothy received a formal notice, the legal kind, on a Tuesday morning. Eli found her at the kitchen table with it in front of her, reading it with the focused composure of someone reading a difficult legal document for the second or third time to make sure they've understood every part of it correctly. She set it down when Eli came in. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of something to say. "Is that from Vantage?" Eli said. She looked at him steadily. "Your mother's mentioned it? They sent us one too. About the lease renewal." Dorothy nodded. She looked back at the letter. "They want me out by September," she said. Not upset exactly. Stating a fact. "They've engineered the process carefully. Everything is legal." "What are you going to do?" She looked at the window. Outside it was June and the light was bright and the parking lot had a quality of heat shimmer coming off the asphalt. "I have options," she said. "I'm not without options. But do you want to leave?" She was quiet for a long moment. It was a different kind of quiet from her usual ones. "No," she said. "I don't." And then lower, "I'm tired of leaving things." It was the most unguarded thing she had said to him in 8 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays. He understood without being told that it was about more than the apartment. 3 weeks later, the notice was quietly withdrawn. Gerald Marsh told Sandra that Vantage had decided not to pursue the 4B vacancy at this time, which Gerald delivered with the slightly bewildered air of a man who didn't fully understand why, but had learned not to question outcomes that were going in the right direction. Sandra told Eli. Eli went up on the next Thursday and found Dorothy in the kitchen, already pouring the soup, and he said, "I heard about the notice." She set the pot down. "What happened?" She looked at him over her shoulder. "I made some calls," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, level and simple and carrying a weight underneath it, that told him the calls had been the kind of calls that moved things. Not the calls of someone without options. The calls of someone who, when they chose to, could be heard. He sat down and said nothing else about it, and Dorothy sat across from him and they ate, and outside the June evening settled into its long warm dark. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The second year was different from the first in the way that second years of things always are: the initial strangeness gone, the comfort deeper, the stakes both lower and higher at the same time. Lower because they knew each other now, in the real way that people come to know each other through accumulated small encounters rather than a single dramatic one. Higher because knowing someone is how you learn what losing them would cost. Dorothy's health moved slowly in the wrong direction. Not alarmingly, not in the way of sudden crises, but in the gradual and honest way of a body that is running down its reserves. By October of the second year, she was not walking well on cold mornings. By November, she had a day here and there when she didn't get out of the reading chair until noon. By December, there was a hospital visit one night, she told him. Just a night. Routine monitoring, she called it. She said routine the way people say words when they've chosen them for their shape rather than their precision. Eli started coming every day in December. Not because Dorothy asked, but because the arithmetic of it seemed clear to him. She was alone more hours than she was not alone, and she was not well, and he could be there. Sandra did not try to talk him out of it. She made the soup in larger batches and kept it in the refrigerator and let Eli take what he needed and trusted him to know what he was doing, which he mostly did, and in the moments he didn't, she trusted him to figure it out. He started doing things. Small things. He brought the packages in from the hall when he arrived before Dorothy could get to the door. He noticed the dish rack getting full and washed the bowls before she could tell him not to. He sat on the floor sometimes with his homework spread around him while Dorothy read. So they were in the same room without the structure of a meal, just present in the way people are present with each other when formality has worn down into something more honest. He learned which nights were bad. He could tell from the elevator, sometimes, from something in the quality of the silence on the fourth floor, and on those nights he sat in the chair across from her and read his own book and did not try to talk. She let him. She didn't say anything about it, which was the most significant thing she could have done. One evening in January, the 2nd January, Eli arrived to find Dorothy at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her and reading glasses on that he hadn't seen before. She took them off when he came in quickly, as if she were slightly embarrassed by them, and then put them back when he didn't react, and went back to what she was doing. "What's all that?" Eli said, hanging his coat on the hook by the door, which he did automatically now. "Administrative matters," Dorothy said. "The trust instrument kind?" She looked up at him over the glasses. "You remember that. You said business. Old obligations." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took off the reading glasses and set them on the table and folded her hands. "Eli," she said. He sat down. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen to it as information rather than as something that changes what happens on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays." She was looking at him with a directness that was more complete than usual, the kind of directness that happened when she was not interested in being oblique. "I have resources. More resources than this apartment suggests. That has been intentional on my part, and I have my reasons for it, and I am not going to explain all of them right now. But I want you to know that I am not without means, and that certain things have been arranged." Eli looked at her. "I'm telling you this because you have been here every day for the past 6 weeks, and you are going to keep being here, and I think you deserve to know that the person you are sitting with is not." She stopped. She picked up the glasses and set them down again. "I am not what I look like from the hallway." Eli thought about the letter opener and the phone call and the way she had said "I made some calls" and the notice being withdrawn within 3 weeks of her saying it. He thought about 14 countries and the mountains behind the photograph and the railroad book and the quality of the language she used on the phone that was the language of rooms where important things were decided. "I know," he said. Dorothy looked at him. "Do you?" "I mean, I don't know the specifics," Eli said. "But I know you're not. I know there's more." He looked at the papers. "I didn't come up here because I thought I could help you. I don't think that's what this is. I came up because you were alone and I heard you." He met her eyes. "The other stuff doesn't really matter." Dorothy was quiet for a long time. The television made its low noise. The building settled into its winter sounds. Outside, the January wind was doing what January wind did in this city, which was remind everyone that warmth was not a given. "Your mother raised you well," Dorothy said finally. "She'd say the same about you," Eli said. "If you'd ever let her come up here." The corner of Dorothy's mouth moved. "She can come Sunday," she said. "Tell her Sunday." He told her Sunday. And on Sunday, Sandra Carter knocked on the door of apartment 4B for the first time, carrying a pot of chicken and rice herself because she said she wasn't going to show up empty-handed. And Dorothy opened the door and looked at her for a moment, the full, assessing look that Eli knew by now was just how she took in people she was deciding to let in, and then stepped back and said, "Come in. I'll get a third bowl." Eli stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to the sounds of his mother and his elderly neighbor beginning the specific and unhurried process of becoming known to each other, and felt something that he didn't have a precise word for yet. Something settled and full and quietly enormous. He went inside and closed the door behind him. The last Sunday came in February. He didn't know it was the last Sunday when it happened. That was the thing about last times, they didn't announce themselves. They arrived wearing the same clothes as every other time, with the same small specific details: the soup in the container, the elevator up, the knock at the door. Dorothy sitting in the reading chair. The television at its usual volume. The news saying what the news always said. But she was very tired that day. More tired than he'd seen. A tiredness that sat on her like something physical. She ate only half the soup and set the bowl on the footstool beside her and looked out the window at the February afternoon. "Tell me something," she said. She didn't say what kind of something. She never did. Eli thought. "I figured out what I want to study," he said. "In college. If I go to college." "When?" she said. "Not if. When. When I go to college." He smiled slightly. "Geography. Maybe cartography." Dorothy looked at him. The look she gave him then was different from any he'd catalogued before. Not the assessment or the careful economy or the brief warmth at the edges. It was open the way a window is open, not cautious, not contained. Just fully present, looking at him, without any of the architecture she normally kept between herself and the world. "I knew that," she said. "I knew that the night you said every map is a decision about what to show." She looked back at the window. "I knew what you were going to become." Eli sat across from her in the gray afternoon. He thought about what to say and decided that nothing needed to be said. They sat together for 2 hours that last Sunday, and the light came through the window at the angle it came through in February, and the soup cooled in the bowl on the footstool, and Dorothy fell asleep in the chair somewhere around 4:30, her breathing slow and even, the reading glasses he'd gotten used to seeing on the table beside her. He stayed until 5. He washed the bowl. He turned the television off. He took the soup container. At the door, he turned back and looked at her sleeping in the chair in the pale late afternoon light. The white hair and the lined face and the swollen ankles and the book on the table beside her that she'd read all the way to the last page. The single photograph in the bedroom with the mountains and the woman who might have been laughing. He had heard her crying through a door once, and he had knocked and he had come back and he had kept coming back. He did not know, standing in the doorway, that he would not see her alive again. He turned off the kitchen light and left the lamp on so she wouldn't wake in the dark, and closed the door quietly behind him. 10 days later, Gerald Marsh knocked on 2C at 7:30 in the morning, before Eli had left for school. Sandra opened the door and looked at Gerald's face, and then turned to Eli with an expression that told him everything before a word was said. Gerald was very gentle about it. He said she'd been found in the morning. He said it had been peaceful. He said the building was sorry for their loss, which was an unusual thing for a building to be sorry for, but Eli understood what Gerald meant and thought Gerald meant it. He sat on the couch after Gerald left, and Sandra sat beside him with her hand on his back, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The pale February light came through the kitchen window. The apartment was very quiet. After a while Eli said, "She told me she wasn't scared." Sandra rubbed his back slowly. "She said she'd had time to get used to the shape of it." He looked at the kitchen table. "I believed her." "I believe her too," Sandra said. He went to school. Not because he felt like going, but because it was a Tuesday, and Dorothy had always been precise about the relationship between difficulty and obligation, and he thought she would have expected him to go. He sat through his classes with the particular numb clarity of a day that is too large to process in real time. He ate his lunch alone and thought about the last Sunday and the window and the gray February afternoon and what she'd said about knowing what he was going to become. He walked home the long way, past the park with the fence his mother had told him about once, the one that was supposed to be renovated and never was. He stood outside it for a moment and looked at the locked gate and thought about what Dorothy had said about mechanisms. About how the process is always engineered to look like a choice. He thought about the letter opener and the phone call, and I made some calls. He thought about the Vantage notice that had gone away in 3 weeks. He thought about the trust instrument and the distribution schedule and the voice she used in rooms where important things were decided. He thought about what it means when someone you love turns out to be more than you knew, and how that fact doesn't change any of the other facts. How the soup was still soup. How the chair was still the chair. How hearing someone cry through a door and deciding to knock is the same decision regardless of what's on the other side. He went home. His mother was already there, which was unusual, and she had made dinner, which smelled like chicken and rice, and she looked at him when he came in and said, "There's a man named Bernard Aldrich who called. He's a lawyer. He wants us to come in after the service." Eli set his backpack down. "He says he has something to go over with us from Mrs. Wren's estate." Eli looked at his mother. "Do you know what it might be?" Sandra said carefully, He thought about the papers spread on the kitchen table and the reading glasses and Dorothy saying I have resources and certain things have been arranged and I am not what I look like from the hallway. He thought about her looking at him with the fully open look on the last Sunday and saying I knew what you were going to become. I don't know the specifics, he said, but I think she planned it. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she set 2 bowls on the table the same way Dorothy used to set out 2 bowls, and they sat down together. Outside, the February dark was settling over the city. In the building above them, apartment 4B was quiet and dark for the first time in 11 years. And somewhere in a lawyer's office, a document written by a woman who was precise about everything, including the things she left behind, was waiting. Bernard Aldrich read the name slowly. Elijah Marcus Carter. The church went still. Dorothy Wren, it turned out, had built one of the largest private education foundations in the state. Quietly, without her name on a single building. She had left it all: the foundation, the endowment, the apartment she'd fought to keep in a trust administered for Eli's education, and then his choosing. The letter inside the envelope, written in her precise hand, said only, "You heard me through a door. Nobody else did. Don't let them tell you kindness is small." Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.